Big business got billions from governments during the pandemic, while workers were left behind. We need to build an economy that works for everyone, not just the powerful few.
De miljarden aan coronasteun hebben niet geleid tot een meer gelijkwaardige en democratische samenleving, stelt economie commentator Grace Blakeley. Tijd voor een andere aanpak.
Hello. So many of you will have seen over the course of the last year or so that there are a lot of newspapers, media outlets who are telling us that what has been going on over the course of the pandemic is the revival or the return of socialism. In the Telegraph, in the UK, the Telegraph newspaper had an editorial saying that we are all socialists now in the fight against coronavirus. The Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, warned at the United Nations that the world was in danger of falling prey to the evils of socialism as a result of the dramatically expanded role the state was playing in the economy out of necessity due to the pandemic. But today, I want to talk about why the increase in the role of the state that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years has nothing to do with socialism whatsoever. And someone who is intimately aware of this fact was one Lenin, who wrote 100 years ago about the erroneous bourgeois assumption that state monopoly capitalism should be seen as socialism. Actually, this is not true. We know that much of the spending that has been undertaken by states over the course of the last several years has been directed towards increasing the power and wealth of those at the very top of society, while workers have been left to fend for themselves. The reason that we have this confusion, that we think, oh, the state's doing more stuff, so that must be progressive, that must be socialistic, that must be something that's good for workers, is that we are used to thinking according to this very binary divide between politics on the one hand, that being the preserve of the state, and economics on the other hand, and that being the preserve of markets. And we have this dichotomy set up in our mind of markets on the one hand and states on the other hand. And those on the right want more market, less state, and those on the left want more state, less market. But actually, if we look at leftist theorists throughout history, they haven't really bought into that divide. Famously, Marx said that the state was nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. It was only really after the Second World War, when you had the growth of Keynesianism and the idea that the state should step in to create jobs and boost economic growth, that we started to have this equation of people on the left wanting more state and people on the right wanting less state, which is how we've ended up where we are today, which is effectively a situation where you've had states all over the world stepping in to boost corporate profits, to boost the wealth of those at the very top of society. And the response to that from some of the biggest media organizations in the world is, well, that's socialism. You've got what you wanted, right? The state's doing more stuff. The state's boosting profits. The state's stepping in. And that is ultimately all we can really hope for from a kind of socialist project. And this has got us into some very odd territory. And I want to talk a little bit today about where we've ended up in terms of particular industries. I'm going to focus on the airline industry and show why these corporate bailouts haven't obviously been very good for society. So many of you will have heard that, a few years ago, let's say 5 or so years ago, Boeing, a US US manufacturer, was developing this new plane, the 737 MAX. And whilst developing this plane, which had huge engines, and big planes with big engines are able to travel further, which means you can have more people on it, which means more profit for the airlines. Boeing was developing this plane, and they realized that it had a fault, which was the engines were too big, it couldn't land properly. So they moved the engines back, and that made the plane unstable when it was flying through the air. And what Boeing did in response to this was engineer a software fix, which caused these planes to nosedive out of the air unexpectedly. And the pilots couldn't do anything about it. The executives at Boeing knew that something was wrong when this was going on, but they didn't do anything. The regulator didn't do anything as a result of kind of neoliberal policy in the US that said, oh, companies should regulate themselves. So Boeing put these planes to market, and we got two massive crashes, one in Ethiopia, one in Indonesia, where over 350 people died because these planes skyrocketed out of the air. Over the course of the development of this plane, Boeing received billions of pounds of corporate welfare from the American government. In 2015, it was called the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the US economy. Over the course of the pandemic, the United States government set up a $60 billion slush fund, which was devoted to supporting Boeing to make sure it wouldn't go under. Ultimately, the company actually managed to get around this and get a loan via the Federal Reserve, or have the Federal Reserve support its borrowing rather than going directly to the US state. So it could say, we didn't take any money from the government, but it did. In the UK, EasyJet took a £600 million loan from the Bank of England and went on to deliver £170 million worth of that money straight into the pockets of shareholders. You've seen this, in France, where the government nationalised KLM, Germany, where the government nationalised Lufthansa, and this public money, our money, has gone basically to line the pockets of executives who work in an industry which is contributing to climate breakdown, with lots of this money going straight from the public into the pockets of shareholders. And even in a case like Boeing, a company that is being propped up by the American state, being fined billions of dollars for basically committing what could only be described as corporate manslaughter. Now, this is not socialism. Obviously, we have a system where the fusion of political and economic power has led to the creation of basically a kind of corrupt system whereby everything that happens, whether it's what happens in the state, in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, ends up benefiting the interests of those at the very top of society. The solution to this isn't to say, right, well, we need the state to do more stuff, or we need the market to do more stuff. The solution is putting power back in the hands of ordinary people. And this is really the big divide, the big challenge, the big battle of our era. Because as we move from the world of the pandemic into the post-pandemic world, all of the big divides, the big questions, the big debates are going to be about who benefits from this transition. Will it be the powerful, those at the very top of our society, the ones who make most of the decisions about who gets what, about our laws, about employment, about jobs, about investment, about innovation? Or will it be the vast majority of people who have very little say over those decisions? In the UK, this battle erupted into our political consciousness with Brexit. What was the slogan for Brexit? Take back control. Why did that slogan have so much resonance among so many people in the UK? Well, it was because these, ultimately nationalistic, xenophobic leaders could go to the British public and say, you don't have any control over anything that's going on in your life. The bosses do, the politicians do, the EU does. Why don't we have this vote which will allow you to take back control? Now, of course, it did nothing of the sort, but the power of that rhetoric is just a taste of what we will get in the years to come. Because as we move from the pandemic into the post-pandemic world, a lot of these problems are only going to get worse. Inequality is going to increase. Pandemics always increase inequality, and this one will be no different. Again, state support has been channeled to the wealthy, while workers have largely been left behind. We are seeing central banks create billions, trillions of dollars worth of new money, and that is pushing up, it's inflating the value of the wealth of those at the very top, while those without any wealth are being left behind. As always happens during crises, monopolies are cementing and consolidating their power over the economy. Smaller firms with weaker links to the state, to banks with lower margins, they go under, and big firms like Amazon are taking even more control than they had before. All of these things mean that we're going into a world in which these disparities, not just of wealth and income, but of power, will become much greater. And we're seeing the impact already that is having on our democracy and on democratic outcomes. If you ask people all over the world, do you trust, particularly in the rich world, do you trust politicians, the media, the people in charge? They will largely say no. And in more unequal societies, they are more likely to say that they don't trust the people at the top, the people making the decisions. This is prime it's a prime time for a backlash against elites in general. And if we can't channel that backlash into something productive, this is the kind of, disillusionment with the system. It's the kind of anger that right-wing nationalistic politicians can easily pick up on and channel into something very, very destructive indeed. So what do we need to do? I argue that if we live in this world where political and economic power are so closely intertwined, where all of our economic and political systems, the state, markets, corporations, financial institutions, they all exist basically to channel power from the bottom up to the top of society. And we consider that democracy is a good way of organizing our politics, when it comes to questions of state power. Why do we not consider democracy an appropriate way of organizing economic power too? How can we extend democratic accountability and transparency from the realm of politics and into the realm of the economy? How can we do that whilst making sure that we decarbonize, that we reduce inequality, that we achieve all the things that we need to do? And my argument is that rather than having capital allocated by the market, which it isn't anyway, because, most of what happens within financial markets is controlled by a few powerful corporations and financial institutions, or having capital allocated by the state, which again, it isn't. It's largely, controlled or influenced by those same corporations and financial institutions. Why don't we have more democratic mechanisms for allocating capital, for allocating resources in our society? Why don't we have a public, decentralized, democratic financial system that would allow ordinary people to prioritize the kinds of things that they want to see, the kind of society that they want to live in? Why not have a democratic, global Green New Deal that would allow communities up and down the country to have a say in how we reach these goals around net zero? Build out our democratic systems, build out these institutions so they're not just these small, limited elections that happen once every few years, but democracy becomes woven into the fabric of our society. That, I argue, is how we really answer this challenge of taking back control. Thank you very much.
Meer Brainwash? Meer verrassende ideeën? Ga dan nu naar brainwash.nl.
Human.